Today's daf we're going to be learning is Yevamot daf kuf. We're getting close to the end here. Okay, we have another few weeks left, which is very exciting. Today's daf is sponsored by Meryl Page in loving memory of her father, George Levine, Yosef Michael Halevi, on his yahrzeit. I'm grateful for his enthusiastic support of my Jewish learning. Dad was an expert in creative tzedakah. He was a mensch to emulate and a loving dad. We're going to get started now with the bottom of Tzadi Teruma Bet. We ended with a list of people who can't get teruma. Okay, I want to just point out before we move on, we've been discussing all these cases of children who got mixed up. And the language of the Gemara used was bimacha, or the Mishna used was bimachave. They're in like a hiding spot or something. So if you read up, Shuli Mishkin wrote an article yesterday that went up on our site, flashback about how this could have happened from a historical perspective and how people lived in caves often and they were hiding in caves, and how in a dark cave, you can imagine the kids could potentially get mixed up. You can't really see so well. And, with, flashlights and headlamps and things like that. So in any case, it's you can read up about that from a bit of a historical perspective on these cases we've been learning. Okay, with that, we're going to start at the braita at the bottom of the page. We'll reread where we ended yesterday. There's 10 people who can't go wait on the line to collect teruma. Who are they? Eluhain, they break up into categories. Okay, right, deaf, person without sane mind, and a minor. Tumtum and androgynous, right? One who either you don't know whether they're male or female, or they have signs of both. Eved Vaisha, a slave and a woman. Okay, we'll see. They're grouped together, although they're not really the same here, even though there are certain things that are similar. Like, for example, they're both exempt from time-bound mitzvot, but that doesn't seem to be the connection here. They don't really seem to be connected. The reasons are different for each. Ha'arel v'hatameh, those go together. We already learned in Parak Ha'arel in our Masechet, right, that a non-circumcised person and an impure person can't eat teruma, so they also can't stand online to get teruma. And nosei isha she'ena hogenet lo, a kohen who marries a woman who is not allowed to marry, like a divorcee, so he would not be able to stand in line. We'll get to the reason for all these in a minute. But they will send teruma to your house, right, hand deliver. The exception of two. It says strange exception. You would have thought it would be three, right? The tameh, the impure, because he can't eat teruma, right? The nosei shashen ogenetlo, we'll see why soon, okay? If you marry the wrong person, we don't send him teruma, even though theoretically he could eat teruma. And you would have thought to add the arel, who also can't eat teruma, and it's a little strange, the arel that isn't found here. Hold off on that, we'll get to it soon. So the Gemara starts off now with the beginning. Bishlama, we understand they don't have knowledge. What does that have to do with collecting teruma online? So I was thinking, if you think about it, when you send a little kid to the store to go get something for you, you wouldn't send them to get eggs probably, because they'll probably break them on the way, right? You wouldn't send them to get something in a glass bottle because they might smash it on the floor. So you would be careful about what items you would send that child to get. So likewise with teruma. Teruma has sanctity to it. You have to treat it properly. So they didn't want to send people who don't have proper knowledge and understanding of how to treat things properly. Makes a lot of sense. Again, you have to assume that someone who's a deaf mute, for example, can't treat things properly. That's a whole question in of itself, right? Do we put them in that category if someone doesn't have that? But the halacha clearly, and certainly in those times, put those people in that category. Whether one wants to argue with that, that's a whole separate question. And it is affected by our perspectives on people with disabilities. But to say that a minor, for example, or someone who doesn't have a sane mind and isn't, right, wouldn't be careful about those things makes a lot of sense. Okay, the deaf mute is always a little bit tricky why they're in this category. But again, perspectives from those days make sense to put them in the category. Today, it might be very different. This is the one that's a little harder to understand. First of all, bria b'fnei atzma is a term that we use specifically for an androgynous, not a tumtum, which means, right, they're a creature in and of themselves. This is one of the opinions. Do we treat an androgynous like a male? Or, right, there's a whole repeat of the chapter that we saw about all these issues. Or is he considered, or are they considered a different entity, right? There's something different that has male and female elements to them. So that maybe you call bria b'fnei atzma. Tumtum is not in that category, but it seems to be saying here they're treated differently, and therefore Rashi says it's hard to really understand what the issue is. So what if they're bria b'fnei atzma? So havia ziluta de kodshim. It's disrespectful for the kodshim to have a person handle them who is considered different. Why this is not so clear. Next, Eved Nami, in Eved, we already learned this. That was the whole end of yesterday's stuff. It's because if they're standing in line, people will think they're kohanim, and then they'll testify about them in court, and they'll say, oh, this guy can get married. He's obviously a kohen, right? Forget about, he's not even a yisrael, right? He's an Eved. So therefore, we don't let them go on the line. Again, this would only be in a place where they do accept testimony. Oh, I saw him on the line, and that would mean he's a miyuchas Jew, right? He's a Jewish person who we know he has good lineage. Next, Arel v'tameh. Notice they skipped the women. We're going to get back to them at the end because this was all brought up. You probably don't remember, but it started with the word bishlama. Bishlama means you go back to a list. Sometimes it's 2 things. Sometimes it's 3, 4, 5. This time it's 10. And it says, Bishlama, this makes sense. We get this. Blah, 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 blah. Why? We get this because of this. We get that. That makes sense. But there's one that doesn't make sense, and that's going to be the woman. Even though we already know the answer because we've learned it, but Gemara is approaching it as if we haven't learned it yet. So, Arel v'tameh, mishum de, they're considered disgusting, so to speak. I don't know if that's the best word, but repulsive. Okay, why? Because they can't eat teruma, right? The Arel is someone whose brothers, remember, why is he uncircumcised? Not because he chose to be uncircumcised, but because his brothers died. And because of that, they died from circumcision, so they didn't allow him to be circumcised. But there's something not right, repugnant about him because he doesn't have a brit milah. He has his orla on him, which we view as somewhat repulsive. Tameh is someone who's impure. So again, that's impurity is a bad thing. So those 2 people, we don't want them handling teruma. First of all, also, you'd have to assume that what we're talking about here is if the tameh could somehow collect the teruma in a way that he wouldn't make it impure, because if he would make it impure, obviously you wouldn't even need to tell us this. It must be somehow he could do it without making it impure, but we don't allow it anyway. A woman who is not allowed to marry, well, we're penalizing him. Why are we penalizing him? Because we want this man to divorce his wife. Remember, kohen marries a grusha. He's a divorcee. He's supposed to divorce her. Any of the women he's not allowed to marry. But you can't force a divorce because you can never force a divorce. A divorce has to be given willingly. So therefore, what do they say? Well, let's try to penalize him in all sorts of ways, just like we do nowadays with someone who won't give a get. One of the ways they penalize him is, oh, you're a kohen? Well, guess what? We're not going to let you stand in line for the teruma. To get your teruma, we're going to make your life difficult. And not only that, we're not going to send it to your house either in order to encourage him to divorce his wife. But what's left? Eli Isha, my time alone. Why not a woman? So for this, Pligi Barav Papa Rav Huna B'Reit Rav Yeshua, once you have a machloket, clearly it's obvious then it wasn't so clear what the reason is. So we have 2 possible reasons. Chadamar Mishum Grusha, either because we're worried she might get divorced and then people won't know that she's divorced and she'll keep collecting on the line. We'll give her truma incorrectly. V'chadamar Mishum Yichud. And the other one says, because we don't want her to be alone in the granary with this man who's giving out the truma, that creates a yichud situation. Right? We're always worried if a man and woman are alone in an isolated place, that might cause something to happen. We want to avoid that. So my benayu, what's the difference between them? When will there be a halachic difference? Ika benayu, beidare de mikarev lemata v'lo shricha b'hu. If it's a place, a granary that is close to the city, which means everyone knows in the city who gets divorced and who's not. So there's no worry that people will not know that she's divorced. They'll know for sure that she's divorced because everybody knows everything in the city. But it's a granary, so it's right outside the city, but it's not a very populated place. So there's not a lot of people, which means it's going to be a yichud problem. Or, Nami, the opposite. Demerachek, it's far from the city. People won't recognize her and know that she's just gotten divorced. But there's a lot of people, so there's no yichud problem, but there's a grusha problem. Now it says, we now have to deal with this strange line about and the issue with what about the arel. So now why the tameh and the arel went together, but now we have a split between them. You can deliver to the house of an arel, but you can't deliver to the house of a tameh. Now, neither of them can eat truma, so why are we even talking about delivering? Well, maybe they have people in their house who can eat truma. So, right, which stands to reason. An arel can't eat, but people in his household can eat, and a tameh can't eat, but obviously people in his household can eat. So Ariel Mishagrinami. So they bring it to their house. Why? My time on Mishum Da'anis. Well, it's not his fault. He's anus, right? He's basically, it wasn't his fault that he couldn't be circumcised. His brothers died. It was a situation he didn't get himself into on purpose. So we're not going to penalize him, and we'll bring it to his house. But according to that logic, Tame Nami Ha'anus, also a Tame. You could have been walking on the street and a sheretz falls on top of you. What are you supposed to do? So they say, well, there's a difference. Someone who became Tameh could have somehow protected themselves. Again, maybe not in every situation, but often you can avoid becoming Tameh, but you can't avoid becoming uncircumcised, if your brothers had died from circumcision. So therefore, we're going to distinguish between those two cases. Okay, and that's the end of the Gemara. But before we finish this, though, I want to point out one very interesting thing. If you look in the Rambam, Hilchot Trumot, chapter 12, halacha 22, if I remember correctly, the Rambam there says, he clearly has a different version of our Gemara, which is what the Kesef Mishna says, which is super commentary on the Rambam, right, or commentary on the Rambam. It's not possible the Rambam had our text of the Gemara because the Rambam says the Ariel, the Tameh, and the Misha, marries someone who's not Hoganet Lo, who can't marry. All three of them can't have truma delivered to their house. And that makes a lot more sense because it really doesn't make so much sense to split between the Ariel and the Tameh. Even though the Gemara comes up with a reason, it seems, and this is just interesting in terms of manuscripts, the Rava must not have had our Girsa, because if he had the Gemara that I just read to you, he would never have said that, right? It's obvious that there's a distinction between the Ariel and the Tameh. So the fact that the Rambam says they're all the same, and none of them can get truma delivered to their house, which actually makes sense because they don't eat truma, so it makes sense we wouldn't deliver it to their house, even though I kind of explained it before, well, maybe there's people in his house. But either way, he puts them in the same category, which makes a lot more sense. And obviously, he didn't have the text we have in front of us. Okay. Tanu Rabbanan. Ha'eved v'ha'isha ein chokim lahem teruma bebeit hagranot. Umkom shechokim, you ready for this? Ladies first, notnim le'isha tchila u'potrin otam miyad. Okay, when we do allow women to collect, which is very strange because we just said we don't allow women to collect, but when we do allow women to collect, ladies first, they get first. Okay, if you try looking up on Google, maybe you'll have a better time searching than I did. I tried to search the source for ladies first. There were all sorts of interesting things that people, I don't know, made up, or really maybe couldn't find anything real with scientific proof, but it definitely was not dated back to the time of the Gemara. Okay, way later than that. But here you have it in the Gemara. The women go first. Okay, they collect first. And here we're going to try to understand. First question is the second question is why did they collect first? The first question is, didn't we just say they don't get it? So how could you say ubimakom shechokim, and in a place where they do go on the line? So first of all, you could say, which the Gemara could have answered, but it doesn't. You could say we just explained if it's mishum grusha, mishum yichud, right? Let's say it's let's say it's close to the city and there's a lot of people, and then you wouldn't have an issue. So the women could collect, but it seems like they're pretty certain that women didn't collect in general. So we'll see that in a minute. So my Gemara, the Gemara wants to understand, what is this braita talking about? Bimkom shechokim. So they say hachikam. This is what they mean. Bimkom shechokim ma'aser ani notnim leisha tchila. The braita starts off with Evev Isha don't stand in line to collect truma. But then they assume, now this is not the simple reading of the braita, and it's always important to point that out because sometimes the Gemara understands the braita differently than maybe the braita really meant. And it's possible that the braita really meant that women could get truma. They could stand on the line in some places, but it's clear to the Gemara that can't be. So the Gemara says it must be we're talking about maaser ani. There's other things that they gave out. Another thing they gave out was to poor people, the tithe to the poor people. And that was done not in a granary where there's more of a chance of things. And there's no issue of a woman getting divorced. Whether you're collecting the poor man's tithe, poor women's tithe, right, has nothing to do with who you're married to, kohen, not kohen. So there the woman's allowed to collect. And because people would do it in their house, there were always people in the house, so there was no chance of yichud. So in a place where you give out the maaser ani, you give to the women first. That's number one. Number two is my time. What's the reason ladies first? And this is, by the way, interesting. If you do a Google search, why ladies first, right? Some people say it's chivalry. Some people say men didn't want to walk behind women. Okay, so well, actually, no, that was a problem. No, maybe they wanted to walk. Anyway, there's all sorts of reasons people conjecture why ladies first. There's actually a funny story that they give that They specifically wanted the women to go out of the caves. They were worried about animals coming, and then the men could attack the animals from behind, something, but kind of endangering the lives of the women. Anyway, there's all sorts of funny things you can find online about it. But here the Gemara has a reason why did they want the women to go. And the reason I'm going to already tell you is not super clear why, but they say, my time mishum ziluta. Okay, what's the reason? It's ziluta. It's demeaning. Now, what is demeaning exactly about it? So either it's demeaning for the woman to wait among the men. Okay, it's like puts the woman in an uncomfortable situation to be around men. Maybe you put the men in an uncomfortable situation to have the woman there, right? It's unclear who the perspective is, who it's, right? It seems to be demeaning to the woman. The question is, why is it demeaning to the woman to be among the men? Not clear exactly. What if there were a lot of women? Then it wouldn't be as demeaning. Anyway, maybe it's embarrassing to, maybe they felt women were more feeble. They shouldn't have to stand on their feet for so long. Maybe it is more like a chivalry type reason. It's not really 100% clear for me. Amar Rava, what's interesting about this is not only was this Maaser Ani, but Rava took this to a different place. So Rava, and here it's a nice story because it shows how he thought one way and then rethought. Amar Rava, Meresha, in the beginning, he's talking now in the court. When he held court and people would come to visit to be judged, there were arguments between men and other men, and there were arguments between women and other women. I guess usually the women were fighting about things that were women-related things, who collected the water at the well maybe, and, she took my water, and maybe things like that had to do with the jobs the women were involved in versus the jobs the men were involved in. So when there would be issues between men and women, I would take the men first. Why the men first? Well, he made the simple logical explanation. Mitzvot. They're obligated in time-bound mitzvot. The women are not obligated in time-bound mitzvot. They got to get out of here so they can do their time-bound mitzvot, whether it's learning Torah, whether it's, putting on their tefillin, whatever it might be. They need to get out of here quickly so they can do mitzvot. But once I heard this halacha about the Maaser Ani and not making the women wait online, I started judging the women first to allow them to leave. My time on mishum ziluta, so as not to embarrass them by making them stand a long time in the line. Again, exactly why it's not 100% clear, but this became, right, he basically applied this to a different area in halacha. Higdilu hata'arovot. We're back to the Mishna. The Mishna said these two children got mixed up. One was a kohen, one was an eved. That's how we got into this, because we started talking about the eved and the eved on the line, and then from there we got into everybody on the line and all that. But we have an eved and a kohen, and we're not sure who's who. We have a big problem, the main problem being neither of them can get married right now. So the Mishnah had said, Shichriru ze et ze. If they each freed the other, then we'd have a yisrael and a kohen, and then the following laws would apply. So they say, it seems weird. It says in the Mishnah, if they, right, they each free the other, right? And this one says, if I'm your master, you're free. And the other one says, if I'm your master, you're freed. So it sounds like yibayim. Ilo ba'ilo. Sounds like it's an option. If you want to, you can redeem him, but you don't have to. Now, again, if you remember the chetzi eved, chetzi ben cholim, the one who has two masters and one frees him and the other one doesn't, and then Beit Shammai, Beit Hillel have this whole debate, and in the end, Beit Hillel agrees with Beit Shammai that, we can't leave him in this situation. We have to force the second master to free him, because otherwise he can't marry, because his free man part of him can't marry a slave woman, and his slave part of him can't marry a free woman. So likewise here, we have these two people, neither can get married. So they say, Amai, why would we say this is just an option to free each other and not that he has to free each other? They have to free each other. He can't marry a shipcha because maybe he's a kohen. But he can't marry a Jewish woman because maybe he's a non-Jewish slave. So Rava says what it must mean is they force him and they force each one of them to free the other. Okay, it is an imperative, not an option. Now, the Mishnah had said, and when I read it, I said, we're going to have to deal with this because why? What is it adding? After the whole long list of all the things, it says, we put upon him the chumras of the kohanim and the chumras of the yisraelim. So what is this referring to? Lamai hilchatan. Amar Papa liminchatan, for their korban mincha. Okay, you probably don't know a lot about the korban mincha unless you're on your second cycle, and we've spent 100, I think it's 100 or so dapim of Masechet Menachot. We will know a lot about it later on in the cycle. But a mincha offering is a meal offering. It's made of flour and water, and it has also some frankincense and all different things depending on, there's different there's different, there's sometimes with oil. Anyway, I'm not going to get into all those details, but the main thing you have to know for today is that there's a difference between the mincha of a kohen and the mincha of yisrael. And what we're talking here is voluntary mincha offerings. If I want to bring a voluntary offering to the temple, but I can't afford an expensive one like animals or birds, right? It goes animals, birds, then mincha. So I want to bring an offering that's a mincha because I'm a simple person. I don't have a lot of money. So I bring a meal offering. All you need is some fine flour and water. You mix it together. The kohen does this. He does what's called a kmitza. If I'm a yisrael and I want to bring a mincha, he does a kmitza. He puts his 3 middle fingers into the batter, takes out a handful, not really a full handful, but 3 fingers full, takes his 2 side fingers, brushes off whatever's extra, takes that piece, burns it on the altar. Again, there's a few more details with the frankincense. I'm not going to get into that, but burns the piece on the altar. And what's left of the dough is called the shirayim. That gets eaten by the kohen. But if a kohen brings a mincha offering, it's ole kalil, according to the pasuk. It entirely gets burnt. There's no kmitza or anything. So now we're going to say, what's this chumrah of Yisraelim, chumrah of kohanim? It means if he brings a voluntary mincha offering, what do we do with it? We treat it with the chumras of Yisrael and the chumras of a kohen. So what is that? Because they're each done in a totally different way. How do you do the chumras of each? So they say, so the minchatam, how so? Nikmetze k'mincha Yisrael, ve'eina ne'echele k'mincha kohanim. You do the kmitza like the Yisrael, but you don't eat the shirayim, the extra part that normally goes, because kohen's gets burnt entirely on the altar. None of it gets eaten. So haketzad, they say, wait a minute, there's a problem here. So they say, well, you do it like this. First, they say it without a problem, then they raise an issue with it. In other words, you can't just not eat the mincha. You can't leave it over. Then it's nota, right? It's like sanctified items that you've left over. So what do? You take a kmitza out, you burn it on the altar, and then you take the leftovers and you burn them on the altar. Sounds like a perfect solution. But whoever suggested this didn't know the following halacha, which is another related halacha. Ikrekan, but then you have a problem. Kol shemimenu laishim hareu bebal taktil. Okay, pasuk in Vayikra Bet Yud Aleph, which is talking about the mincha, says any mincha you can't make a chametz, you can't have saul, okay, leavened anything, and you can't have dvash, honey in it. Then it says lo taktiru mimenu ishalashem. Don't burn from it nished God. What does that mean? Don't burn from it. What do we learn from this? So the drasha is kol shem mimenu. They kind of switch the order around. Mimenu, if from it, some of it gets burned, meaning you take a kmitza, you separate it out. You separate the kmitza out. Anything that you separate out and part of it gets burned, the rest of it is bibal taktiru, which means you're not allowed to burn the rest. So what this basically means in simple words is if you separate this mixture and part of it has to get burned on the altar, the other part is not allowed to be burned on the altar. That's the drasha. That means these shirayim can never be burned. So you want to be strict like both. Separate the kmitza, burn it, and then burn the leftovers. You're not allowed to do that halachically. So how do we deal with that? 2 possible answers. Amar Rabbi Yehuda b'reit Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi, timasik lehu l'shum eitzim. Well, there's 2 ways you can burn something on the altar. One is to offer it up as a korban, okay, like a sacrifice. You know, the kmitza is a korban type of thing, right? Korbanot aren't only animal sacrifices. That you obviously can't do. But, and that's what we're going to see in a minute, is called li'isherech nichach, right? You want to make this pleasant smell. You burn things on the altar to have this pleasant smell to God. But it's another way you could burn something on the altar. You could say, this is my firewood, where you're not burning it for the sake of burning it, but you are burning it. So that way it gets burnt, so it's not eaten and it's not left over, which is the problem, right? You can't do that. But you're also not burning it for the sake of burning. You're just having it as wood. So, and that goes with only one opinion, though. It goes with Rabbi Eliezer, or I think some people say it's Rabbi Elazar. The Tanya. Rabbi Eliezer omer, l'reach nichach yatamale, aval atamale l'shum eitzim. He darshans from reach nichach, just reach nichach you can't, but for eitzim you can. To which the Gemara says, okay, well, hanicha Rabbi Eliezer. So that works. So we have a solution according to Rabbi Eliezer. You burn it as wood. You put it in the bottom of the fire, right, in the pile of wood, and it burns like that, not as opposed to kind of burning it as an offering itself. But the Rabbanan, who disagree with him and don't think you can do this, ma'ika l'meimah. So they say, to Avid Rabbi Elazar b'Rabbi Shimon, we have a second solution. Titanya. Now here, we're in a different topic of a minchat chote. There's something called the korbano levi yored. It's a korban. If I do a particular sin, I can bring, there's a few sins that you bring a korban levi yored for. I'm not going to get into the details, but if you're wealthy, you bring animals. If an animal. If you're less wealthy, you bring 2 birds. If you're less wealthy, you're really poor, you bring a meal offering. That's called a minchat choteh. Now, minchat choteh has its own, now the question is, do we split in the minchat choteh between a kohen and a yisrael? When I said there's a difference between them, we were talking about the voluntary mincha offerings. Here's the sin offering, and there's a debate about how we treat the sin offering of a kohen. Is it like the mincha of a kohen that the whole thing gets burnt, or is it like the mincha of yisrael where you get to eat the shirayim? So Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon said, no one really thinks you can eat the shirayim, but they're going to say, it's very similar to our situation. Hakometz karev latzmo, v'shirayim mitzpazrin al beit hadeshen. We take the kometz and we burn it like a mincha yisrael, but we can't eat the shirayim. So what do we do with them? We put them there's like a garbage pile where they would put the deshen, all the ashes. So they would put them in the beit hadeshen. Mafilu Rabbanit lo pliga le Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon ela b'minchat choteh shel kohanim tibat hakravi. Aval hacha afilu Rabbanit mod. So when the rabbis there disagree, they think the whole thing gets burned. But that's because it's a minchat choteh of kohanim. Like they disagree specifically about that. But in our case, where we have a person, it's not the same thing. We have a person who's maybe a kohen, maybe Yisrael. Even the rabbis will agree that we can sprinkle it. We can take that extra batter, and instead of giving it to the kohanim to eat, and we don't burn it, even as eitzim, because they don't agree with that opinion. So they agree. Even the rabbis who disagree with him on the minchat choteh would say here they can scatter it in the beit hadeshen, and that would work. So we have 2 possibilities: either burn it shum eitzim, or scatter it in the garbage pile. And this basically shows that this was all to explain that passage. What does it mean, the chumrei kohanim and chumrei yisrael? And this is what it is, specifically for the mincha offering. I bet if I had asked you this before class, you never would have guessed, right? But that's what the Gemara explains. Next, now we're moving to a Mishna. For this, we have some presentations for today. Okay, we're now talking about something we learned about a long, long time ago, which is that a woman, after being married to a man and something happens with the marriage, okay, all different possibilities. He dies, he divorces her. Maybe it was out of wedlock. We don't know, but she was with a man and she's supposed to wait 3 months before being with another man so as to be sure who the child is. But here we have a woman who didn't wait 3 months. So Misha lo shahata achar ba'ala shlosha chodeshim. Leah was married to Yaakov. They had a son Reuven, and she doesn't wait the 3 months after. In this case, we put it that she got divorced. Okay, so she gets divorced from Yaakov. He divorces her, and now within 3 months she marries David, which again she's not supposed to do. And v'yalda, and she has a child, Shimon. Okay, so Leah has 2 children now, Reuven with Yaakov, and Shimon, who we don't know, is Yaakov the father or is David the father? So this is very similar to our previous cases where we didn't know who the child belonged to. Okay, so it's similar but different because it's not the babies got mixed up, but it's another similar situation that we're not sure who he belongs to. She also then has children that are definite children between her and David. Now we have Shimon, who's between Reuven and Levi. They all share the same mother. This is going to be different from case number 2, where they don't share the same mother. They all share the same mother, but we don't know if Shimon has the same father as Reuven or the same father as David. Now, this is obviously relevant for laws of yibum, because if he's the brother, or they're the brother of him, then there's yibum. If he's not, then they're brothers from the mother only. There's no obligation of yibum, which means it's asur mishum eshet ach. It's forbidden by Torah law for them to marry her. So let's read what happens. Okay, so now, if Shimon marries Tamar, then what happened? And Shimon dies without children. So we learned that Hayula banim min harishon banim min hasheni. If she had 2, right, sons from the first marriage, sons from the second marriage, chotzin v'lo miyabmin. Okay, basically both of them do chalitza with Tamar, Shimon's wife, because neither can do yibum, because maybe they're only brothers through the mother, which would then forbid them to marry their brother's wife. But maybe they're brothers from the father and are obligated in yibum, so they do chalitza. V'chein hu lahen. Now, what about, okay, same situation. We have, 3 brothers here, same exact situation. But in this case, they each married women and they each died, Reuven and Levi. And now Shimon has to do, Reuven married Yael and Levi married Dvorah, and Shimon now has to do, what can he do to them? choletz v'lo miyabem. He also can only do chalitza because it's the exact same problem. Maybe they're only brothers through the mother, in which case their wives are forbidden to him. Okay, so that's the end of Amud Aleph. Now going to Amud Bet. Hayulo achim min harishon ve'achim min hasheni shelo me'oto ha'em. Now the case could be a little bit more complicated. She's going to have married Yaakov, who had another wife, Rachel, and they had a son, Yosef. And when she gets divorced and marries David, David has another wife, Michal, and a son, Moshe. So we now have Shimon is born to Leah within these, right, basically within a few months after marrying David. There wasn't 3 months in between. We're not sure who he belongs to. He now, though, notice, he doesn't share the same mother. None of them were born to Leah. Okay, one was born to Rachel and one was born to Michal, but he's questionable whether he's the brother from the father of each of them. So once you remove the mother from the situation, they don't share the same mother, you already remove the barrier of no yibum, right? There's no problem of doing yibum because either he's the brother through the father and he's obligated in yibum, so he can marry her, or he's not the brother through the father and he's not the brother through the mother, in which case she's just a random woman and he can marry her. So therefore, if they all have wives here, hu choletz umiyabem, he can either, now this says choletz umiyabem, what it means is he can either do chalitza or do yibum. Okay, so he can do chalitza with, if both Yosef and Moshe, his brothers, die, okay, or his suffix brothers, maybe they're his brothers, maybe he's not. He can either do chalitza with both of them, or he can do yibum with both of them. Okay, that's an option. The ham, what about them? Then it's a little bit trickier because Shimon's got one wife. And one of them is the yabam, one is not. So we already know this. Echad choletz, echad miyabem. Since there's no isur for them to marry her, the only issue is that maybe she's a yevamah of somebody else. So the first one does chalitza and removes the barrier. And the second one does yibum. Okay, so it's either, I say I went a little too quickly, either, right, I see this is wrong. Okay, either Yosef does chalitza with Tamar and Moshe then does yibum with Tamar, or Moshe does chalitza with Tamar and then Yosef does yibum with Tamar, meaning it doesn't really matter who does chalitza with who or who does yibum with who. It's just a matter of the order is important. The chalitza has to happen first, and that we're going to see in the Gemara. We've seen that line many, many times because if the first one, remember, they can both marry her as just a random woman, unless she hasn't done yibum. So if they take care of her chalitza first, then in the worst case, right, or either way, either the first one was the yabam, he does chalitza and she's free to marry the other guy, or the first one wasn't the yabam, the chalitza was a meaningless ceremony, and the second was the yabam and he does yibum. So either which way he can marry her, either midin yibum or because he can just marry her. Now, case gets a little bit more complicated, although you already learned this mainly in the previous Mishna. Haya echad yisrael ve'echad kohen. What if one of the fathers was a yisrael and one was a kohen? Now, we don't know what's the status of this child because kohen Yisrael Levi goes by the father. We don't know who his father is. So, no, say isha re'uya lekohen. He can all, again, we're going to get into the whole list of things you have to be strict about. Number one, assume you're a kohen, so only marry a woman who a kohen can marry. You can't become impure to dead people. But if you do become impure, you don't get lashes because, again, this is a warning of death. Right? Well, if you're a kohen, this is forbidden. But if you're not, it's not. Well, you don't get punished for something like that. Teruma. You can't eat teruma because maybe you're not a kohen, right? This is where we look at him in both perspectives. But when it comes to monetary things, we don't make him, right? We basically don't make him pay anything because he can claim, well, prove I'm not a kohen. He can't collect in the goren because maybe he's a yisrael. If when he separates from his own produce, his truma, he can sell it and get the proceeds for himself because, again, go prove I'm not a kohen. He can't get parts of the sacrifices. Nobody gives them their bechor, for example, their firstborns. But if he has a bechor, you don't take it away from him. Or right, anything that says you don't take away, that's kachim. He doesn't have to give 3 matanot, the parts you give of an animal you sacrifice. If he has a firstborn, he leaves it to graze until it dies. Then he's allowed to eat it because otherwise he has to sacrifice it and he can't sacrifice it because he's not a kohen for sure, right? It's not a for sure kohen. Which would be again the mincha, I guess. Again, the way the Gemara understands it anyway. Hayushnehem kohanim. What if they're both kohanim? Now we get into all sorts of details, and that's going to be the case we're going to really deal with in the Gemara. Hu onen alehem vehem onenim alav. The laws of onen is when you're burying one of your close relatives. So when you're a kohen, you can't eat sacrificial meat. So he's not allowed to eat sacrificial meat, right? In this case, he's a kohen for sure. So he can eat sacrificial meat in general, but not when he's an onen, meaning when each father dies, he's not allowed to eat the sacrificial meat because maybe it's his father, maybe it's not. Then, heim onenim alav, if he dies, both fathers also can't eat sacrificial meat then till the burial because maybe they're an onen. But we don't allow either of them to become impure to each other because, again, we don't know who's the real one, right? Who's the father? He can't inherit then because, again, all the sons could say, go prove you're our brother. You can't prove it. Well, you can't get any money. But heim yorshimoto. Both fathers, when he dies, both fathers split his inheritance. Why? Because this is the classic example. Again, we'll get all to this in Bava Metzia. Mamon hamital b'safek. There's money that we don't know who it belongs to. Cholkim, we split it 50-50. So it's kind of ironic, right? He doesn't get to inherit any of their stuff, but they inherit him. Upatul, this is an interesting one. Al makatov al kilalato shel zeh v'shel zeh. He curses or hits his father, he gets the death penalty, but not in this case because, right, he could actually do both of them. We're going to talk about that tomorrow. What if he did the both at the same time? But let's just assume right now, each one is what we call a hatra'at safek. Maybe this is your father, and if you hit him, you'll get the death penalty. Well, maybe it's not my father, so you don't get punished for that. If you want to work in the temple, there were weeks you were supposed to work in the temple, but anyone who wants to volunteer and work in the temple is allowed to, even if it's not his week. So you can go work in the temple whenever you want, on this week or on that week, but in a cholek, but you don't get a portion of the meat. Otherwise, everyone would go and take the meat. No, the meat of that week, of all the sacrifices, goes to the people who it's their turn. And since you're not sure it's your turn, you can't claim the food because they can say, go prove that it's your turn this week, and you can't. But if both fathers were part of the same mishmar, they were working in the temple at the same week, then he'd be able to get a portion because for sure he's a kohen and for sure it's his job that week to work in the temple. Okay, you can see how the Mishna thinks about everything. Now the Gemara says, again, I told you we get to this. Dafka michlatz v'hadu yibum. Clearly the chalitza has to happen first, and then the second guy does yibum. Aval yibum bereisha lo. You can't do yibum first. Kapaga v'yama l'shuk, because you're going to end up marrying a woman who's a yevamot, right? And you're allowing her to marry somebody else, possibly. Amar Shmuel, and we're going to deal with Shmuel for the rest of today. Asara kohanim omdim. Shmuel says this halacha, which we're going to soon question from our Mishna. 10 kohanim are in a group, okay? I don't know. You have a gang of kohanim standing around. You'll see why I call them a gang in a minute, because see, they're not going to do exactly appropriate things. Peresh echad mehem u'ba'al. One of them leaves the circle. We don't know who it is. And he goes and sleeps with a woman, and they have a child. Now, we don't know who the father is, because we don't know which guy left the gang of kohanim. Havlad shtuki. The child is called a shtuki. A shtuki, we say, right? When you ask him who his father is, right? Mishatkinoto, right? He doesn't know to say, right? We silence him because he doesn't have the answer. My shtuki. So now what does it mean is a shtuki? For what relevance? If it's that when he comes to inherit his father's property, they say, you can't inherit, go prove it's your father. Pshita. Shmuel didn't need to tell us that. It's obvious. We have no idea who his father is. So of course, if he claims for one of the 10, that's my father, no one's going to listen to him. That's not what Shmuel's saying. He says, this guy can't work as a kohen. Now, it's a little bit weird. Why can't he work as a kohen? He's definitely a kohen. We know his father's a kohen because they were all kohanim. My time. Well, what's the reason? Amakra says by Aharon, Vaitalo ulizaro achara. It's for you and your children after you. Could have just said zara'o. Obviously, zera, your children are always after you. Why does it say after you? In order to be a kohen to work in the temple, you need to know your lineage. If you don't know who your father is, you can't work as a kohen, even if you know your father's a kohen. So Rav Papa says, what are you talking about? If you take that literally, then you'll take this pasuk literally and you'll come to a very strange conclusion. By Avraham Avinu, it uses the same language. Dichtiv, liot lechal Elohim, I will be for you your God. You will be my nation, right? For who? Lizaracha, acharecha, for your children after you. Now, do you mean to say, Hatam, my kamisa rachmana, what is the Torah telling you? That if you don't know who the father is, your child's not Jewish? That's not true. If you know who the mother is, your child's Jewish. It doesn't matter if you don't know who the father is. So they say, no. That was in a different context. That means something different entirely. What God was telling him is, for you, I will be your God, and for your children after you, he's warning him, don't marry a Gentile woman or a slave woman, because then your children will leave you. In other words, God was saying, I will be your God and stick with me and marry within your own people so that your children will follow in your footsteps. Okay? So that we dealt with. Made today. But comes the Gemara and asks another question on Shmuel. Remember, Shmuel's halacha is these 10 guys, one went out, had a child. The child can't work as a kohen. So the braita says, Rishon ra'oi liot kohen gadol. Now, what's this case? This is a case we learned in Perek HaCholetz. Rashi tells us, the brother did yibum within 3 months, and now we don't know who the child is. So again, it would be a case where it's kohen, and his brother's obviously a kohen because the brother's through the father. So the child can be a kohen gadol. So here you see, how can he be a kohen gadol? Forget about it. He can't even be a regular kohen if we don't know who his father is. So they say, that's just a derabbanan halacha, and the pasuk is just an asmachta. And how does that help us? Well, if you were married, we have no problem to the first husband. It's only znut. What was Shmuel talking about? A znut case. It was outside of marriage. Then we penalized. If it was a marriage, we don't penalize. That's where the Gemara is going to start questioning. Biznut because of Rabbanit. Really? The rabbis say biznut, you can't be a kohen? What about our Mishna? We're now going to prove that our Mishna, we thought in the presentation, what did we show? She was married to the first husband and got divorced from him. Now we're going to show can't be divorce, can't be death of the husband. It must be znut. Okay. How do we know this? From the different details the Mishna talked about. What does it mean after her husband? So we're going to start with different options. First husband died. Well, it doesn't make sense. Why? Because what does it say? He can go into a status of onaim for them, and they're in a status of onaim for him. Well, what would be the case if the first husband was dead already, right? So bishlama hu onein alehem. He could go into a status of onaim for them, both fathers. That actually works. Why? Mishkach alav b'nisuin desheni. It was marriage to the second one. In other words, the second one died. Okay, for sure. He died after his birth. That's clear. V'likut atzamot dekama. Maybe when they gathered the bones, remember, they had a whole different way of burial in those days, and they would put them in these caves, right? They would wait for the flesh to disintegrate. Then they would collect the bones and bury them. So maybe it's onaim for the first husband, even though he had died before the kid was born, right? Before his mother married the second guy and before he was born. Well, they did likut atzamot, and then you would be an onaim that day. Okay, but heimon and alav, well, the two fathers go into a status of onaim for him. If the first guy's dead, he can't go into a status of onaim for his son. Okay, so he's already dead. Can't be that. Ela begrusha. So if you need him alive, so maybe he divorced the first wife. Well, maya char ba'ala, char get ba'ala. Okay, after a get. Well, that doesn't work either. Ema seifa, hu ein mitamei lahem vehem ein mitamim lo. He can't become impure to them. They can't become impure to him. So bishlama hein ein mitamim lo l'chumra. Okay, they can't become mitamei to him. L'chumra, we don't know if he's the son or not. Maybe it's not a son, and both fathers are kohanim. Ella, who ein mitamei lahem aman. Now, if it was divorce, what happens then? The second husband's a kohen, and he married a divorcee. Oh, wait, you can't do that, right? And if you do that, what's the status of the son? He's a halal. If he's a halal, he doesn't have laws of kohanim on him. He can actually become impure to a dead body. So again, bishlama l'sheni, the second one lo l'tamei le, because right, if he was really the second one, he doesn't become impure to him. Ela rishon l'tamei le mimanavshach. The first one, he should be able to, no matter what. Iberehu, if he's his son, hashabir kamatamei, he become tamei to him. Ibar batrahu, if he's the son of the second one, shapir kamatamei de halalhu. If he's the son of the first one, right, then he can't be mitamei to the second one because it's a kohen. But if he's the son of the second one who married a divorcee, he's a halal, and then he can be mitamei to the first one. So that doesn't make sense. So it can't be a divorcee. And so what's the other option only? It must be znut. Well, it says after her husband died or after her husband divorced her or whatever. Well, it doesn't mean her husband, after she had relations with him. It means it was outside of marriage. And then what does it show? Here's the problem for Shmuel. It says he can work in the temple on that mishmar or that mishmar. So what do you see? Biznut, you can work in the temple, to which the Gemara is going to bring two answers. First answer is, Amar Shmaya b'mima enet. You could find a case here. Not divorce, not death, not znut, but miun. Remember that? She's married at a young age by the mother or the brother because the father's not around. She can then just get out of the marriage. And she gets out of the marriage within 3 months, marries someone else. That could be a good case. However, the Gemara says, what are you talking about? She can't have a child. It is until the age of 12. Now we've learned, and this is where I'm going to show you, this differs from some things we learned. You really have till 12 and 6 months. But this seems to say you only have till age 12. We'll see right now. This is also a repeat sugya. 3 women can use birth control. A minor, a pregnant woman, and a nursing woman. Right? Because we're worried she might get pregnant and die. Now, there's an assumption here again. The assumption is she for sure, there were 2 ways to read this. Here it seems she for sure is going to die. Therefore, it couldn't be she was a ketana, could have done miun and then got pregnant because she would have died if she got pregnant. She wouldn't have made it. The pregnancy wouldn't have happened. Because she might get pregnant a second time while she's already pregnant, might crush the other fetus, and it'll cause her milk to dry up and the child will die. It's from age 11 to 12. That's the age where you can use birth control. Right? It's just dangerous for your life. But any less than that or more than that, you can't. They can all have relations without birth control. Mina shamayim yuchamu, right? A bit of a crazy shita. May God help. God helps the foolish. Therefore, they don't use birth control and they just hope for the best. In any case, what do you see here? If she's doing miun, she couldn't have gotten pregnant. She's too young. So therefore, can't be miun. Gemara is going to answer, and we'll stop right here. Okay, it could be a case of the kiddushin was done. It was a mistaken kiddushin. Maybe it was on a condition that never happened, and therefore the marriage is annulled, and therefore he's not a halal, the second one, and the father's still alive, and you resolve all the issues with this one. We'll talk about this more tomorrow. Have a great day, everybody.